Hello, I'm Dustin Benton. I'm the Chief Analytical Advisor for the National Food Strategy. And I'm here to give you a bit of information to help you talk about the transition to a sustainable diet. At the National Food Strategy, we have three goals. We're trying to make our diets healthier, better for nature, and to address the carbon emissions associated with the food system. The kind of big picture story here, and I should say before I get too deep into it, that this isn't government policy, this isn't something that has been decided on. We're presenting some information, we're very keen to hear your view, we're an independent review. And we think, as an independent review, that there are three unrelated reasons that get you to roughly a halving of meat and dairy consumption by around 2050, and perhaps a third reduction by 2030. And those are health reasons, climate reasons, and nature reasons. And I'll talk through a bit about why those reasons are. So these are the three headline challenges. So the first big challenge I want to talk to you about is health. And there are two dimensions to that. There's the personal health side of things and public health. In terms of personal health, this is stuff that mainly affects you based on what you eat. And two things we want to talk about today is heart disease risk, which is very closely correlated with the amount of red meat and dairy that you eat, and cancer risk, which is very strongly associated with the amount of processed meat and to a certain extent red meat as well that you eat. Really, from a personal health perspective, we know that the average person in the UK eats about twice as much meat and dairy they should, just from a personal health perspective, and that's before you even think about the wider public health challenges and questions. The other side of things is the public health dimension. So this is not just directly what you eat, but the sum of all of the things that we eat. There are two aspects of this. The first is antimicrobial resistance. So this is to do with antibiotics that we use in intensive livestock. You cram a bunch of cows or pigs or sheep or chickens together, you need to keep them healthy. So they're very often fed antibiotics to try to keep the bugs out. But these are the same antibiotics that are used when you go into hospital to keep you from getting infected and maybe dying. And the trouble is, because we use these antibacterial and other things so much in livestock, it makes them ineffective, so that maybe the next time you go into hospital, the drug that you could have used a year or two ago will no longer keep you safe. The second type of risk is what's called zoonotic disease. And quite simply, this is just disease that comes from wild animals and infects either our livestock or through our livestock, us. Some examples I'm sure you'll have heard of are SARS, MERS, swine flu, bird flu, Ebola, and COVID-19, of course. This matters because when people interact with wildlife, when we convert land from wilderness into farms, and because intensive farming next to wildlife areas means that wild animals end up infecting our livestock. In fact, diseases like SARS and bird flu and swine flu, they actually needed intensive livestock because they got into them, they mutated, they became more virulent, and through that, they then got into us and made us sick and killed people. COVID-19, by contrast, transferred very rapidly probably from bats through pangolins to people at a market that sells wild meat. And very simply, because animal agriculture is the biggest use of land in the food system, if we eat less from animals, there's less pressure to expand the land, so we won't be so much entering into new wild areas, and there will be less zoonotic disease. The second reason is a climate reason. We know that the food system creates about a fifth of the greenhouse gas emissions that we're responsible for, around 30% if you include the food that we import to eat. Animals alone directly generate about half of that. That's either them burping out methane or emissions that come from the manure that they produce. So there's a direct relationship there, but there's also an indirect one, and that's how we use land. So all the plant foods that we eat, apple pie, avocado on toast, beans on toast, all of that we grow on just 15% of the land that we use to grow all food. And one of the things that we can do with land is to use it to absorb carbon emissions, but growing food on it is sometimes in conflict with doing that. We know that crops we grow to feed to animals or grass we feed to animals uses 85% of the land that is necessary to produce our food. and that if we gave some of that over to new woodland, or if we reduced the density of the animals on the land and allowed the grasses on the land to sequester more CO2, to store more of it underground, that we could get a much better use of land from a climate change perspective. So the third major issue is nature. And that basically means the animals and plants that live on the land and in the sea. And that's different from climate change, which is mainly about heat and flooding and drought. Agriculture uses so much land that it just dominates human impacts on nature. Half the planet is used for agriculture. It's about 70% in the UK. And of that, at least 3/4 globally, it's a bit more in the UK, of the land is used for animals. So grass for sheep and cows, or food for animals like soy for cows, pigs, and chicken. And in simple terms, because animals use a very large amount of land for a relatively small proportion of our nutrition, about 2/3 of our calories and half of our protein comes from the 15% of the land that grows plants for us, as opposed to the remainder, which grows either plants for animals or animals directly for us. Nearly 60% of species loss is from land use change. The next largest amount is from hunting wild animals, and in the UK and Europe, that's mostly about fishing. So in essence, the main issue here is we probably need to have less meat and dairy so that we can make space for nature, whether that's nature on a farm or whether it's nature in wilderness. But these big factors are not the only things that matter when it comes to food. Food isn't just about the headline challenge, it's about our values too. And I'm going to give you a few things to think about in that space as well. The first obvious thing to say is that how we eat is related to how we use the land. And the easiest example of this is the picture on your left, which is a classic English landscape. It's a pattern of small fields and grass, and essentially it's designed for cows and sheep. On the right-hand side, you see a landscape that's been managed for nature rather than for animals that we eat. It's actually in Belgium. It's part of a project which is allowing land to be used more for nature. Less meat, probably we'll want to use our land to save nature and store carbon. Does it matter if landscapes change as our diets do? Another important factor is rural culture, which is deeply linked to the animals we grow. So on the left, you've got the Olympics opening ceremony, which presents the UK as a green and pleasant land, grassy fields for cows and sheep, and a little bit of wheat notes as well. On the right, you've got Old MacDonald, who, of course, as we all know, had a farm with chickens and pigs and cows and sheep. The song doesn't really talk about soybeans or peas or wheat. This is deep in our culture. But the economic basis of rural culture has changed, and that rural culture has survived. Over the past 70, maybe as much as 100 years, animal agriculture has gone from a really big part of our rural economies to really quite a small proportion now, but we've kept the culture. Does this show we can keep the culture even as we eat less meat and dairy? After all, lots has changed over that time. Beef consumption has fallen by about 1/3 since the 1970s, while chicken consumption has tripled. What's the relationship? What do we want to keep? This is probably the most challenging issue I want you to consider. We can see out there in the world that meat can be used, dairy as well, as a political tool. So we have the UK Vegan Party. Donald Trump has suggested that meat eating is associated with his political philosophy. Do you think this is legitimate? Do you think it's fair? To what extent is meat and dairy part of your political identity? Do you think it should be? Don't you? Really interested to understand how you think of things. Flavor is an obvious issue to discuss because ultimately food's a very personal decision. We can get really good flavor from a spectrum of different kinds of foods. On the left-hand side, we've got meat and dairy-based foods, which are very tasty, very flavorful. In the middle, we've got a kind of balance between vegetables and meat and dairy. And on the right, we have just plant-based foods. Where would you want to not cut back on meat, and where would you want more fruit and veg in your meal? We're interested to know. And the final issue I want to draw your attention to is animal welfare. This again is a big, emotive, challenging issue. But what we can say is there's been a correlation between intensification of animal production and welfare challenges. So you can have high welfare, high intensity production, and you can have very low welfare, low intensity, very extensive production. But as a general rule, the challenges which you see here, pigs and farrowing crates, chickens, intensive chicken production, indoor dairying, is associated with trying to get the maximum amount of meat and dairy. I should say that this is more of an international picture than the UK. The UK has very high animal welfare standards, and some of these are actually illegal in the UK. But nonetheless, this matters enormously if you're thinking about how your consumption goes. So with that, I want to thank you and hand back to the moderators to have a great discussion. Thank you.